Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Keller Center or joining us via live stream. My name is Sadia Sindhu, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government here at the Harris School of Public Policy. We're so thrilled to welcome you all to this first event as part of our newest initiative, Data and Democracy, a joint collaboration between CEG and the university's Data Science Institute. I know we're joined today by a number of students from across campus, some from DSI's Summer Lab program, others from the Summer Institute in Social Research Methods, students and other affiliates of the Masters in Computational Analysis and Public Policy program, and more. So I want to start off by just saying a few words about the Center for Effective Government, the Data Science Institute, and our Data and Democracy Initiative. DSI is a new unit that executes the university's bold and innovative vision for data science. Originally launched in 2018 as the Center for Data and Computing, DSI seeds research on interdisciplinary frontiers of this emerging field, forms partnerships with industry, government, and social impact organizations, and supports holistic data science education. Similarly, CEG is a relatively new center on campus, founded in 2019 with the mission of strengthening democratic institutions and improving the capacity of government to solve public problems. Like DSI, CEG has three broad pillars that define our work. We build upon sound, evidence-based research and ideas from across disciplines. We elevate those bold ideas through dialogue, outreach, events, written work, and other engagement activities. And through education, we give practitioners and aspiring leaders the tools they need to implement reform ideas in service of their organizations, government, and communities. Given the unique overlap between our two centers, along with the varied research expertise between the two, DSI was an ideal partner to launch the Data and Democracy Initiative this year. We launched this initiative to conduct cutting-edge, collaborative, and cross-disciplinary research to better understand the digital threats facing democracy, to convene key stakeholders, and to circulate and amplify the findings needed to protect our democracy in a digital age. This initiative is already off to an exciting start. So far, we've provided grants for 4 research projects led by world-class UChicago scholars, 2 of whom you'll hear from today, including YC Liang and Danielle Grisenda. We've also started marking important connections to those doing work in the field every day in the data and democracy space. As part of CEG's annual Senior Practitioner Fellowship, we brought in 2 leading experts in digital democracy, including Tiana Epps-Johnson, who will speak to you today, and to work with our experts on these important issues. We're also beginning to work with numerous other organizations and companies doing their own work on these issues, including companies like Amalas. And we're joined today by their President and Chief Technology Officer, Dan Dubois, our final speaker this evening. And the goal of this evening is really to learn from each of these in their pursuit of a stronger, more effective democracy for the 21st century. And lastly, we're so excited for opportunities to connect the work of this initiative with students who have immense talent and passion for data science and democracy here at UChicago through programs like Summer Lab, MSCAP, and our MPP program. That's why we're here today to share some of this initial work of our experts and partners with you all. We want to draw through lines between the important research happening on widely different topics, like identifying and predicting political messaging bias, fortifying and securing our election infrastructure, and protecting our democracy from extremists and other terrorist actors online using AI. And we want all of you and many others to understand the important role that both data science skills and a keen understanding and appreciation for democratic institutions and structures have in this work. We're excited to leave some time at the end of this discussion for Q&A, and I will be moderating a conversation with all of you and our panelists. But before we begin, I want to quickly thank my colleagues at DSI for their continued partnership on data and democracy and for their work putting together this event. I should also thank the Harris School of Public Policy, our host this evening, and our home for CEG for your support on this event and all of CEG's programs and efforts, as well as the university for its support of the Data and Democracy Initiative. I'm also appreciative of our co-sponsors, DSI Summer Lab and the MSCAP program, for helping to put on this event and helping to promote it all across campus. And lastly, to my CEG colleagues for your ongoing efforts to make this a success. And with that, I'm thrilled to turn things over to my colleague, Dylan Schaefer, to introduce our first speaker for the evening and to kick us off. Dylan is an assistant director at CEG, where he co-leads data and democracy, as well as the communications and external affairs of our organization. And he's been with our team since 2019. Welcome, Dylan.
Thank you, Sadia, and welcome everyone to our event this evening. We're thrilled to have you all here, and I'm really thrilled for the opportunity to introduce each of our speakers tonight. And the first is Tiana Epps-Johnson. Tiana is a 2022 Senior Practitioner Fellow at the Center for Effective Government and the founder and executive director of the Center for Tech and Civic Life, where she leads a team that is doing groundbreaking work to make U.S. elections more inclusive and secure. Prior to this, she was the New Organizing Institute's Election Administration Director from 2012 to 2015. She previously worked on the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She is also a 2021 Emerson Collective Dial Fellow, a recipient of the 2020 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and was selected to join the inaugural cohorts of the Obama Foundation Fellows in 2018 and the Harvard Ash Center Technology and Democracy Fellows in 2015. Tiana earned a Master's of Science in Politics and Communication from the London School of Economics and a BA in Political Science from Stanford University. As a senior fellow at CEG, Tiana focuses on investments in election infrastructure, administration and security, facilitating information sharing, and implementing best engagement practices across different sectors and government agencies. Please join me in welcoming Tiana to the stage for her discussion on securing our country's election infrastructure.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dylan, and thank you everyone for having me. A quick show of hands. How many people are currently worried about the ability for the U.S. to hold free and fair elections? That is not surprising. For those of you who are on the live stream, most hands went up. But the first thing that I want to share is the good news. Despite us being on the midst of 2 years of literal disinformation about our election process, the 2020 election was the most secure, one second. Let me just make sure that these are on. Oops, wrong way. There we go. The good news is, despite being within 2 years of a literal disinformation campaign, the 2020 election was the most secure election that we have ever had in our nation's history, according to our community of folks that work on those issues. We also know that it was the most diverse electorate that we've had in over a century and the highest turnout election. And that happened even in the midst of a global pandemic. And it happened when we thought that that might not be possible. When you look back to April of 2020, our election process in some places was brought to its knees. Think back to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for example, where they were able to open just 5 of their 180 polling places, with voters waiting for literal hours in long lines. But ultimately, we saw expectation-defying success. Election officials, with the support of hundreds of thousands of volunteers who showed up to be poll workers, administered, again, the highest turnout, most secure, most diverse election in our history. And at the same time, there is a lot of bad news. And not only bad news if you are thinking about levers around policy for how to change our elections. One of the things that is really overlooked in our conversation about advancing access and security and integrity in our elections is the basic resourcing that we need for our election infrastructure. And currently, that election infrastructure is being pushed to its brink. Our basic election infrastructure is according to the Department of Homeland Security, some of our most critical infrastructure. It is infrastructure that's on par with things like our power grid and water supply, but we don't invest in it like it's critical infrastructure. Right now, we invest just about 0.5% of county budgets to maintain our local election infrastructure. When I talk about infrastructure, I mean things like the facilities that we need to make our voting process work, the physical infrastructure that we need, the human infrastructure, like the people and poll workers that make our election process happen, and the technological infrastructure. All of these things are currently being massively underinvested in. And in 2020, I got a really up close and personal view of what that looks like for local election administrators, the folks who are on the front lines of making our voting process work. We're in the midst of the pandemic. My organization that I lead, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, administered a private philanthropic grant program to election departments who were struggling to make ends meet that election. We ultimately delivered about $350 million to election departments across 49 states, so about 2,500 grantees total. And that meant that folks could do things like afford to invest in that basic election infrastructure to keep voters safe during the 2020 election. And we also collected about 2,500 stories from local election officials about what those investments meant and what they need to move forward. And that has led us to some of the most important work that we are doing today. As we see these historic underinvestments be intersected with growing threats for election administrators, for example, rising violence being directed at these folks who are doing frontline administration, to things like rising costs. For example, right now, paper costs 50% more than it cost in 2020 because of supply chain issues due to the pandemic. So we are not only seeing historic underinvestment, we're seeing rises in costs due to current events, and we're seeing growing threats both on the safety of election officials as well as cyber threats. We just, from DHS a few weeks ago, got word that we should expect to need to continue to protect these systems from foreign actors, especially as we look at 2022. So, following our work in 2020 with election officials and gathering their stories about what this means for their ability to do things like have up-to-date voting equipment and enough staff to make our process work safely and securely for everybody, we began to make a data-driven case to Congress for proper public funding for election officials. I'm going to talk about 3 examples of the ways that we've used data to make this case, and the ways that we've partnered on some of this research, and ways that we've done independent research to make a data-driven case as well. One of the things that has been really effective in us being able to make the case for how much funding is actually needed to support our election infrastructure is being able to make comparisons about how woefully underfunded our infrastructure currently is. One of the ways that we do that is by amplifying existing research by academics in the space. For example, MIT has an election data science lab that has looked at what is the status quo about how we spend and what are the costs of elections today. One of the really important insights that they were able to draw recently is that we spend about as much on our critical election infrastructure as we do to maintain parking facilities. But just having those types of comparisons is not enough to make a case to policymakers to invest what we now know is tens of billions of dollars, which is what is needed in order to actually shore up our election infrastructure. And so we have partnered with one of our core policy partners, the Institute for Responsive Government, to do a state-by-state look at what investments are needed over the next decade to make it more concrete to policymakers so that they understand in the places that they represent what might be needed. And so this was a mix of doing a research scan of what academics had already known about the status quo about election spending and election needs, but then us doing our own analysis on top of that to look into the future and recognize what we think are normative costs for election infrastructure based on the places that do it best. And so with our 50 states of needs analysis, we're able to break down not only a state-by-state look at what investments are needed over the next decade, but also do that looking beyond the status quo and instead into a system that would actually function the best for voters. To make these even more granular for policymakers to hear directly from election officials, we chose some salient states to be able to show, with more not only data but stories, what these types of investments mean and what underinvestment means as well for voters. This is an example from South Carolina. It describes the ways that equipment would be updated if the proper investments were made. and also helps to describe what the current limitations are in a really concrete way to break down what we know is a tens of billions of dollars ask. And then, as I mentioned before, because of our work in 2020 of being able to work with thousands of election departments across the country, we were also able to collect stories directly from them and do our own independent analysis to understand other ways of describing what are the types of investments that are required right now and why they're so urgent. So this is one example of that. We were able to overlay our current information about election infrastructure investments and also an understanding of some of the places where just the basic essential needs, like having offices that have internet or having enough full-time staff are lacking, and we're able to put that over a congressional district map to make it even more granular for decision makers, as well as being able to show what it would look like to make incremental investments, or what just a portion of the need might look like, recognizing that you don't always get your ask in full when you first make a case. But there's so much more to explore, and these are the types of things that we look forward to partnering with folks on here at UChicago, as well as other institutions. For example, we know that there's deep disparities in the spending from election jurisdiction to election jurisdiction at the local level, but there's much more granular work to do to understand the ways that local differences, for example, in tax base, drive underinvestment in this critical infrastructure for our country. Looking forward to digging in more in the panel, and these are a few ways that you can connect with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Tiana. Our next talk this evening will be from Daniel Grisenda and YC Leong, two inaugural recipients of Data and Democracy Research Grant funding. Daniel Grisenda is a staff data scientist at the Data Science Institute, supporting its partnership with the 11th Hour Project. He engages with social impact organizations across the domains of energy, food and agriculture, human rights, and marine technology to support applications of data and computer science. Daniel's work is focused on increasing the data capacity of these organizations, lowering the barriers to mission-driven data science, and empowering these organizations through the development of sustainable technical solutions. And YC Leong is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UChicago, where he directs the Motivation and Cognition Neuroscience Laboratory. His research examines the different ways in which goals, desires, and needs affect how people perceive and respond to our environment. His work draws from the traditions of cognitive neuroscience, social psychology, and affective science. He uses a broad range of methodological tools, including behavioral experiments, computational modeling, fMRI, pulpometry, naturalistic paradigms, and network analyses. By combining different tools and perspectives, he seeks to characterize motivational influences on human cognition at the psychological, computational, and neural levels. Please join me in welcoming YC and Daniel to the stage to discuss their project, Understanding Divergent Interpretations of Political Information and the Bias of Universal Sentiment Measures.
Hello. Hi. Can people hear me? Great. I'm YC. That's Daniel over there. I swear we didn't coordinate our outfits. We just happened to wear the same thing. So yeah, let's see. So I'm going to kick us off, and then Daniel's going to take over in a sec. So I think there's a general perception that that the United States is polarized, that we are a country divided, a tale of two Americas. About 5 years ago, I came across an article that really caught my attention. So in this article, there wasn't any shocking statistics or fancy infographics. Instead, it was more of a slice of life piece about two women working in the same diner in Mississippi for over 20 years. These two women have known each other almost all their lives, and they have great affection for one another, and they are friends. But they agree next to nothing on politics. And this article tries to capture this intricate, intimate, and constrained dynamic of these two women as they navigate their daily experiences. So one of the things that really stuck with me for this article is the very last sentence. So the context for this is the Supreme Court Justice confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, but I think the question itself is something that you could apply to any political event of significance in recent years. How can we both hear the same thing and come away with something totally different? This is a question I think about a lot. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training. I studied the neuroscience of human perception. And I started to wonder, can we use these tools from cognitive neuroscience to study and understand how people understand political messages? So the idea that the same sensory information can be processed and interpreted differently by different people is not controversial in vision science. These are some of the very familiar visual illusions that many of you might have seen. Now consider the sentences or phrases: defund the police, America first, my body, my choice, 2020, my body, my choice, 2022. Each of these statements, the same words, mean something very different to conservatives and to liberals. And at this moment, you might think, oh, well, these sentences, these phrases, they're politicized. There aren't that many of them. This is not a general phenomenon. Now take a moment and consider the more innocent, neutral-sounding sentence: we must keep our communities safe. What does this sentence mean to you? And what do you think it means to someone who does not share your political beliefs? The meaning of a sentence is not just the sum of the meaning of the words in it. It depends on context in which it's spoken, individuals' beliefs, their prior experiences, and their biases. So the goal of this research program is to understand how people interpret information differently by using cognitive neuroscience tools like brain imaging and natural language processing on textual data. Now, brain imaging is not a common tool that's commonly used to study political cognition, but I would like to convince you that it holds promise. So in my lab, we use several different brain imaging techniques, but the one that we use the most is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. So this is an MRI scanner. This is actually the one that we have at the UChicago hospital about 2 blocks from here. And what we do with it is to measure changes in the flow of oxygenated blood in the brain. And the idea here is that a brain area, if it's more active, it's doing more things, more oxygenated blood would flow to that area. And by detecting changes in magnetic properties, we can get a sense of which areas of the brain are more active than one another at a given moment. So we call this the blood oxygenation level dependent or BOLD response. So in recent years, cognitive neuroscientists have started to study how people interpret naturalistic information by scanning people watching movies. So some common data sets include The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, BBC's Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, and Friday Night Lights. So essentially, we span lots of genres and different eras. And what these studies have found is that we can effectively use the BOLD response while people watch these movies to predict what people are attending to as they watch these movies, when they are emotionally engaged by the story, what emotional experiences they are feeling as they watch these movies, and also we can predict what they later remember. So more recently, we and a handful of other labs have started to use these techniques to study how people consume political information, such as talk shows, news, campaign ads, and political debates. So why might we want to do this? Being able to tell when people are engaged and when people are paying attention is very useful. And fMRI affords a couple of advantages in this respect. So first of all, what we get out of this is a continuous and real-time information. So we don't have to pause the video and ask people, what are they thinking? Instead, we're measuring the brain's natural response to these videos. And as a result, it's less susceptible to response bias, because when you ask people what they're thinking, they might not always report this truthfully. And in addition, even if they were trying to report things truthfully, decades of social psych research suggests that people don't always know why they think the things they think and why they do the things they do. So even if they were trying to be truthful, they might not be able to tell you what actually is going on. So by measuring participants' brain activity in real time as they're passively watching these videos, we kind of get around this effect. And then finally, the data that we get from neuroimaging is actually really rich and high-dimensional. It's not just a single brain signal that we're getting. Instead, different brain areas are doing different things at different time scales. And depending on your research question, you can look at different aspects of these brain signals. So just to give you a sense of what we've done with this, I wanted to tell you a little bit about a study we recently did. So what we did here was we recruited conservatives and liberals and scanned them while they watched videos on immigration policy. So during the time we ran this study, immigration was the hot button issue, and people would be looking and viewing these videos on their social media feed all the time. And all we told participants was, come into the scanner and watch these videos as you normally would watching a video on the news, on the TV, or on your phone. It was important to us that we didn't spread misinformation, so none of the videos contained any information that was blatantly false or spread conspiracy theories. So these are videos that were all taken from YouTube, that we fact-checked, and that basically were videos that participants could encounter in their daily lives. So what we found was that even though these participants, they were watching the exact same video, the same videos, their neuroactivity diverged between conservatives and liberals. So effectively, conservatives' neural response to these videos were more similar to other conservatives, liberals' brain's response was more similar to other liberals, and they were systematically different from one another. We call this phenomenon neuropolarization. So we only see neuropolarization we don't see it everywhere in the brain. In fact, we only see it in one brain area known as the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, which is the brain area that integrates and interprets sensory information. So we don't see neuropolarization in auditory and visual areas of the brain. So it's not as if participants were literally seeing something or hearing something different. It's how they interpreted that information. Furthermore, we found that neuropolarization, the magnitude of it, predicted the strength of attitude change after watching the videos. So we could predict, based on your brain activity while you're watching these videos, how likely you are to change your support for immigration policy after watching the videos. And then lastly, we also looked into the videos to find what exactly was driving this neuropolarization signal. And we found that neuropolarization was stronger during moments of the videos where there was threat-related and moral emotional language. So one interpretation of these results is that conservatives and liberals find different things threatening and have different ideas about what the morally right thing to do is. And in recent work, we started to try to test this idea using natural language processing models. So I don't have much time to go into this in detail, but essentially what we did is we relied on language models that were trained on conservative and liberal text sources. So for example, conservative-leaning and liberal-leaning news media, as well as conservative-leaning and liberal-leaning subreddits. And effectively, what we do is we try to look at these word associations. And what we found was that word associations in these text sources differed along the dimensions of threat and morality. So conservatives and liberals in these text sources are, what we're getting from this is that the same words are perceived as having a different level of threat or different level of association with morality, depending on whether the text itself was left-leaning or right-leaning. And what we hope to do is to try to tie these two ideas together. On one hand, you have the brain responding differently to particular types of messages. On the other hand, you see in text sources that people are using these language differently. Now, are these two phenomena related, and can we study them together to get a better understanding of what exactly it is that people are interpreting differently from these political messages? And that brings us to the project that we have with the Data and Democracy Initiative, an opportunity to actually test this idea. And with that, I want to cede the floor to Daniel.
Yeah. Thanks, IC. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're hoping to put these two ideas together. And this is the work that YC and I actually met about a year ago at a Data and Democracy event, a kind of a mixer to get interdisciplinary researchers together and talking about the work they do. And we got to talking and brainstorming about this idea and thought about how we could put these two ideas together. So I'll start. YC did a great job giving you a little more detail about context, but The meaning of each word in language is really defined around or has traditionally been thought of as the words around it, right? Really influencing the meaning of the word. But context doesn't just include the other words around it, it also includes the listener's perspective, so what they think, what they believe, what they've experienced. So recent studies have demonstrated that deep learning is really good at predicting these neural signals. But we hope to train specific variants of these models that focus on subgroups and can hopefully, by training on subgroups and having a better understanding of the particular state of mind of that subgroup, they can even approximate those neural signals even better. So how are we going to do this? These are the details, and this is the work we started this summer. We have three sets of input data. We have conservative text sources, liberal text sources, and these neutral text sources. We take a pre-trained language model like BERT, and we add a classifier head that can distinguish between, in the first case, conservative versus neutral. And that we train that for a long time, and eventually when it gets good at distinguishing neutral or conservative, that's when we freeze those weights, and we're going to call that convert. That's our expert at deciding conservative text sources. And then we do the same thing. So we take a brand new pre-trained model, we feed it liberal and neutral sources, teach it to classify, and then freeze those weights. And to be equal in our assignment, we'll call that LIBERT. So we take these two experts, and to bring this data together, we use these two expert models to then try to predict the actual neural response that we get from participants in our study. So we have a participant in our study, we put them under an fMRI machine, and we get a neural signal as they watch a stimuli or any sort of political debate. And that neural signal is what we use we use these two models to predict it, and if the subject was, say, a conservative, we would expect the convert to be better at predicting that signal. And that's just one idea, so we're really excited about generating this data set. We're hoping to scan about 50 people this summer, with the goal that this will be a very rich data set, and there'll be a lot of extensions we can bring to this work. So we could even just start with the brains, the neural data we have from each of these subjects. So we have three-dimensional images of the brain as they go through these stimuli. So we have conservative brain, liberal brains, and neutral brains, and we can repeat the study, just training on the full brain signal, and then try to predict words from that. And then finally, the larger goal is really to build better NLP models in the end. As YC was saying, there's a lot of kind of biases that go into the labels from natural language processing, especially in sentiment and polarity. So you have these groups of human labelers that are reading words. They look at words and they try to approximate the sentiment of each of those words. And that requires also some metacognition, right? How do you feel about the word you just read? But we're hoping that fMRI can serve as kind of a better ground truth for these polarity and sentiment signals. And we can use this study to kind of better understand how much data is in these neural signals and what's the cost to collect this at scale. So finally, we'd like to say thank you and shout out the two students who've been helping us with this summer. Sue, who's a part of the DSI Summer Lab program, and Ren, who's the lab manager in YC's lab. We've been having a lot of fun this summer. This is me getting scanned, so I got to test the stimuli. And if this sounds interesting to you and you want to be a part of the study, you can use that QR code or the URL in the top left or top right. But there are some larger goals for this project. We're really hoping that we can better understand how political pundits and organizations use language to really drum up support from their bases, and better detect that highly polarizing use of language. And our largest dreams are to be able to actually edit that language, still make the message sticky and have the same reach, but maybe not be so polarizing to the other side. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel and YC, for that informative talk. We're really excited about this research and glad we can help fund it through the Data and Democracy Initiative. Our final speaker for this evening is another practitioner working on the cutting edge of data and democracy, Ben Dubow. Ben is a leading expert on digital propaganda, with over a decade of experience tracking the online influence operations of jihadis, white supremacists, and autocratic states including Iran, Russia, and China. Ben's research on Russian and Chinese online information operations has appeared in Bloomberg, Reuters, Newsweek, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Euractiv, and has been targeted by Sputnik, while his work on the dark web forums of the Taliban, the Shabab, AQAP, and AQIM was featured in the Associated Press, CNN, and AFM. Ben currently serves as CTO and president of Omelas, a firm dedicated to preserving democracy against the disruptions of the internet age, and as a fellow at the Center for European Policy and Analysis. Before Omelas, Ben was president of Code to Inspire, a nonprofit that taught Afghan women to code and find work online, as well as a consultant for Google, where he played a lead role in removing ISIS content from YouTube and establishing the redirect method, a digital CVE effort. Ben's deep technical knowledge of data architecture and machine learning allows for uniquely extensive and original research and analysis. Ben also speaks Arabic, French, Farsi, and Russian. Please join me in welcoming Ben to the stage for his talk on applying the philosophy of propaganda to practice using NER and network analysis. Ben.
So my first job out of undergrad, I was tracking jihadi and white nationalist propaganda online. I would go to the dark web forums where they would deliver their messages to rally their followers and recruit new members. My first month in this job, I had an assignment that would radically change how I thought about the world. I was reading communiques issued by what was then the Islamic State in Iraq, and one of these communiques was about a marketplace bombing. And I still remember to this day the sense of glee and joy in the author's text as he described how a second set of bombs was timed to go off exactly as victims were arriving at the hospital. This was a message that was meant to recruit members to their cause, and I could not imagine something more morally repugnant. Yet this was seen to the participants in this forum as a moral duty. They responded with praise, with thanks, with adulation for what to me was the worst act imaginable. I couldn't understand how something that was so morally repulsive to me could be viewed as a moral duty to someone else. As I spent more time on these forums, I began to see that if I changed a few of my assumptions, big core assumptions to be sure, but if I changed them, it might not make sense entirely, but at least I could see how they were internally consistent. After this job, I bounced around for a little while before I wound up at Google. While I did some side work still related to jihadis there, my main task was kind of the boring core of what Google does every day, delivering ads. And this is really what Google thrives at, using data on audiences, on messages, to figure out when to deliver an ad that's going to coax somebody to buy a product or a service, or at a minimum, convince the advertiser that it was the ad that coaxed somebody to buy a product or a service. I realized, though, that at the core, Google was asking a very similar question. What sort of messages resonate with what sort of audiences and why? That was the initial insight behind the founding of my current company, Omelas. Our idea was that we were going to take the technology that advertisers use to understand loyalty to brands, to understand loyalty to extremist groups. As we build out our product, we realized that it could apply to a lot more than just extremist groups. We could apply it to propaganda of all kinds. And what we wound up building was basically a social media marketing tool for the worst people on earth. So we succeeded in developing this. For any message, whether it was from a Russian propagandist, Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece, an Iranian radical imam, we were able to give an idea of how many likes it got, how many comments, its reach, its engagement rate, everything that you could get when you were working in general advertising. The only question we could really answer was whether or not it worked. We still couldn't answer why it worked. So, like any good researcher, when we wanted to get this answer, we looked at the literature. And we started looking into the theory of propaganda. Now, propaganda, as we currently think about it, as a prerequisite needs means of mass communication. So it really wasn't until the early 20th century that people started to really think at a deep level about what propaganda meant. And two of the initial founders of this field of the theory of propaganda were Edward Bernays, who popularized the term and is considered the father of public relations, and Walter Lippmann, a prominent journalist who theorized about the role of the government and mass media in creating popular opinion. For both of them, the answer really came down to the same place. The assumptions, biases, presuppositions, preconceptions of the audience was going to determine whether or not a message actually resonated with them. As these theories developed, and as propaganda reached its mature form in World War II, in fascist Italy, in Soviet Russia, and in Nazi Germany, theorists began to think more about the relationship of propaganda and power. Antonio Gramsci, a theorist who was jailed by the fascists, came up with the idea of cultural hegemony. According to Gramsci, whether intentionally or not, all cultural creators embed their production with their own biases, their own assumptions, their own worldview. When the ruling class has monopoly on the creation of culture and its dissemination, according to Gramsci, they are able to propagate and impart in all of society their biases, their assumptions, and their worldview, chief among them that their place as the rulers is deserved and the natural order. Michel Foucault arrived at a similar idea. For him, all meaning was relative. It was all based on context. Every object, every thought was part of a network of thoughts and objects and history. And the full extent of this network, which he termed discourse, determined what was true and what wasn't true. This ability to control what's considered knowledge and what's considered just a conspiracy theory is at the heart of power, according to Foucault. Now, I'm talking to you guys as part of a data science program, so I probably should stay away from postmodernist theories. But if for a second you'll entertain me that we can derive some testable hypotheses from these ideas, both Gramsci and Foucault have something really interesting to say, not just about propaganda, but about the authoritarians that are spreading propaganda as well. If propaganda contains within it the assumptions, the biases, and the worldview of its creators, of the ruling class, then we should be able to discern from that propaganda the biases, the assumptions, and the worldview of those rulers. So instinctively, this makes a lot of sense. I've spent the past decade constantly reading Russian, Chinese, Iranian jihadi propaganda, and I can tell you I have a much better understanding of how they view the world because of that. But if we take Foucault even further, and we believe that this is really the extent of possible thought, then we can really understand the bounds of possible actions of authoritarians by being able to develop an understanding of their worldview. So how do we go about this? Well, luckily at OMLOS, we've been at this for a long time. So within our database, we have about 7 million texts that were produced by the Russian government, whether official offices, media organs that are owned by them, or by allied tabloids and media groups. We have 2.5 million from the Chinese government, 1.2 million from the Iranian government. All of this data has been extensively annotated by our team, so we know its full ownership structure, we know how it ties back to the government, and we know its target audience. It's also gone through all of our named entity recognition so we understand what's being talked about and when. So with this data set, what we're trying to do is to look to understand what within this is going to tell us these biases of the propagandists and by extension of the authoritarians. And we have to do this because we're in the field, because we're delivering this as a dashboard that will be used day in and day out at scale so that we can process 100,000 of these texts every day and derive that meaning. So our approach so far is to start simple with a regex search to find any hits that might be telling us about the major events in a given time period and in a given region. The idea is that when we're able to see these events, when we're able to understand the protests, the marches, the military actions, the coups that authoritarians obsess over, we'll be able to understand what they think is challenging them and what their next moves will be. So when we first take that regex filter, we then go in to the actual structure of the sentences where we find the hits for these sorts of events. Using that structure, we're able to understand what the event is, when it takes place, as well as who the participants are. A lot of extra steps there that I'm glazing over, but that's kind of the general idea. So when we come up with all of these events, what we'll see is that a lot of these events have references, or a lot of these articles are referencing not just one event, but a past event as well. When there's a coup, when there is a mass protest movement in a Russian client state, US media might point to the jailed journalists, the endemic corruption, the diminishing standards of life, as they explain how this event came to be. Russian media will explain how George Soros has been funding organizations within that country. So when we see these links within an article, we're able to build out an actual network map of these events, where all of the nodes are the events themselves, and all of the edges are the articles that are referencing, either directly or through analogy, these events. And the more articles we have, the more weight we give to these edges. As we look at this map sequentially, and we see how nodes connect to one another, and we follow the heaviest edges from node to node, from event to event, we're able to develop for our users an understanding of how authoritarian allies in Russia and China and Iran understand these events, how differently the context is for them. And we're able to understand how tyrannical leaders who view themselves as shaping world events view history, view the flow of history up to that point, and we can start to understand how they aim to change history by seeing the stories that they're not only telling their own people to justify their actions, but that they're telling themselves. Democracy is in a perilous stage right now, as my other panelists have referenced. Those who want to destroy it, who want to show that it is a weak and failed system of government, have a view of the world that is radically different than our own. In an earlier age, it would be impossible to fully understand that without spending years and years living in those countries, listening to that propaganda. With the rise of the internet, with our ability to collect propaganda from all over the world and actually analyze it and derive meaning from it, we're able to understand and allow our users, allow anyone to understand at the deepest level how the worldview of authoritarians fundamentally differ than ours, and how we can craft messaging that both promotes democracy and appeals to their people. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Nope? Okay. Give us a second. Oh, there we are. Okay, thank you, Ben, Danielle, YC, and Tiana for some really rich presentations. We're now going to move into our panel discussion and Q&A. So I'd love to invite all four of you back here. We'll go ahead and get started. And Dylan, you'll keep me honest on time. Great. And if you have questions, we have two of our colleagues that are walking around with mics, just flag it to them. Happy to take questions as they come up as well. Okay, so I want to start off by giving us some time to think about how some of this work might intersect with the work, how your works might sort of intersect with each other. So I'm going to turn to our industry folks first. Tiana, I'm looking directly at you. As you sit here kind of absorbing some of the other things that were shared, are you finding some natural connections to your work or things that you might want to explore further? How are you reacting to some of this?
Yeah, I think at a high level, when I think about the different methods that each of us individually are employing and what we're trying to accomplish, there's a lot that is intersecting. And then I also think on a subject matter basis, there are some really interesting intersections. So I think sort of at the highest level, I think about the ways that we each are describing different types of theory and the ways that we are then looking to find practical applications to test that theory, learn more, and then turn that into new theory that then we can test some more. And so whether it's propaganda or polarization or theory about proper public financing, we each are looking at different ways of being able to understand more deeply through data the ways that we can push that theory by actually trying to do things in the real world. I also find a lot of commonality in the sense making that I think that we're all trying to do, whether we're looking at individual nodes of a tyrannical leader or an individual's like particular insights internally about immigration, or whether it is the way that an individual election department looks from a resourcing perspective. That tells us something about that specific person or leader or an election department, but when we look at things in aggregate, we have much richer insights that can tell us dynamics about what's actually happening that then can lead into that sort of cycle around developing better practice and theory. I think that sort of really concretely, all of this work around trying to understand how people make decisions, and then how we might influence those decisions or nudge those decisions to find better outcomes for our democracy is something that is clearly an intersection. I can't wait to figure out ways that we might be able to draw in our own work around influencing policymakers, for example, use information about how we might present the work that we're doing in ways that are less polarizing, for example. And so just see that there's a lot of richness also in the types of work that each of you all are doing that might be applicable to the types of advocacy that we're looking towards to advance election access and integrity.
And I think a lot of what you just sort of pointed to is exactly what the Harris School is all about, evidence-based policymaking, testing out these theories. It's also what a lot of these students here are thinking about at the DSI Summer Lab as well. Ben, with the work that you're doing, I'm particularly interested if there might be connections with YC and Daniel's research.
Yeah, I was a little taken aback by how
Yes.
similar what you guys were talking about was. As you could tell, I did not have a presentation, so they could not have seen it beforehand. But it seems like you guys are working on almost the exact same thing, figuring out how the same message, the same event can be interpreted in a radically different way. And understanding that at the level of neurology is just a level of depth that really blows me away. But for those training texts, I mean, I think it's very obvious how we could potentially partner on looking beyond just the United States at the world as a whole.
And then I'm going to turn to our two scholars on the panel as well. One of the things that we've tried to do very thoughtfully at CEG, and I know is something that a lot of UChicago centers think about, is interdisciplinary research. So you talked a little bit about how the two of you met. Can you speak to a little bit more about how you thought about connecting your two disciplines and what some opportunities are, which we clearly saw through your presentation, but also what were some of the challenges in thinking of this from two very different perspectives?
So I think Daniel said a little bit of the story of how we met. I think we met at one of these networking events where the DSI and the Center for Effective Government brought scholars from different fields together and basically just talked about what they were working on at a given moment. And what happened, at least with us, was that we sort of like pitched different ideas, and we realized that we had different skill sets that would be really good to be able to put together, because I am trained as a psychologist, I'm a neuroscientist, I look at brain signals. I have an interest in language, I have an interest in natural language processing, but fundamentally that's not what I do on a day-to-day basis. But I have some ideas on how I might be able to apply those techniques into the data that I'm using in a way that I've never, I'm not personally able to do it on my own. And when Daniel came along, it was sort of like, at least in my view, the perfect kind of like person to fit into this idea that I have had for a long time, where I've been looking at these brain signals. I find that people respond to them differently, but why is that happening? I need something a little bit more quantitative, something that relies on tools in NLP that are out there. I just didn't have access to them, so that was a great opportunity. And in terms of, I just also thought I would take this opportunity to it's events like these that I think really bring together people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, and having heard both Tiana and Ben's work, I'm like, there's so much we can do together in terms of studying how we persuade, studying how we make sense of things, using tools that, in my view, I usually study an individual at a time, but trying to scale from that individual level to the aggregate. The opportunities in between, I think, are just really endless. So I just thought I also wanted to make a pitch for events like these in terms of bringing people from different fields together. But I'll leave it to Daniel to add to that too.
No, I think you did a good job. Yeah, we were really just talking about ideas we had for different projects for data and democracy. And I had a background in biology and had done some work with ABC on calling elections. And so this was kind of the perfect project. And I was very excited to work on this data. But for all our students out there, I would say this is a good example of, when you see an interesting idea and you see a research project you want to be a part of, reach out, because that's really how this started. And we had a couple planning meetings, and it turned into a year of work.
You took me naturally to the next part of this conversation, which is we have a lot of students in the audience that are interested in pursuing careers in these spaces broadly, but also maybe specifically in some of the areas and the work that you all do. I wonder if you could, and you can respond to whichever part of this question is most appealing to you, but one is sharing a little bit more about your background and how you got to do the work that you have done. Ben, you did this a little bit in your presentation, and the other piece is really just giving advice or things that you would like to share with them for folks that would join your team either as researchers or sort of early career professionals. That's the primary audience here. I'll let you respond to whichever one appeals to you most. Tiana, do you want to go ahead and kick it off?
Yeah, I'll share a little bit about my background because I found data and technology as a happy accident. I was a poli-sci undergrad. I studied politics and communication in a media and communication school for grad school. And then I found myself really interested in the challenge of making voting more accessible. And so I was on a team that developed the first ever online polling place lookup tool in partnership with Google and the Pew Charitable Trust and others, so that now it's really easy to go online and be able to look up, put in your address where you go to vote, and help to expand those tools across the internet to include information like who's on the ballot and other things like that. So for example, right now, if you were to go online and say, who's the governor of Illinois in a Google search browser, you'll see that it's J.B. Pritzker, and the first source down on the source is CTCL. And so I was really interested in a problem, which was how might we make it easier for people to find just the really basic information that they need to be able to be effective citizens. And it happened that I found myself on a data and technology team where I was able to tackle that challenge, not through something that originally I thought might be by getting a law degree one day, but instead was by developing out practical tools so that people can just overcome those barriers in the first place, and now figured out ways to expand that work into working with government directly. But all of that has been a series of relationship building, being really open and curious about not just the paths that I've been told about, but interested in, for example, once having a supervisor in a place full of lawyers who didn't have a law degree, and that's what led me to recognize that maybe that wasn't the path that I had to go on. And so just being really, I once heard someone describe being consistently falling in love with the problem, but not your solution. And I think that that is something that I really hold dearly, is that my work has looked like everything from doing graduate research to being a technologist to now leading an organization where I do some of all of those things, but I've like never stopped falling in love with the problem.
That's great. I think that's one of those things where it's like you never stop asking questions, which is exactly what a place like UChicago really deeply invests in.
Yeah.
We can go wherever we want to go here.
Yeah, I would definitely reiterate with
Yeah.
what Tiana said, both in terms of finding a way to follow your passion. I'll be very blunt with you. It's pretty rare your first job out of undergrad is going to be what you're passionate about, or even your second or third job. But your early jobs don't need to define you. I'll also hit again on like this idea of networks, that being absolutely clutch. For a small business, it's hard to overstate how much of a risk hiring somebody is, same with a nonprofit. So if the hiring manager has that sense of trust with you, it makes all the difference. But back to actually building that network, go out, go to events like this, find a nonprofit that's working on an area you care about and volunteer for it. Maybe it won't lead to the next great job for you, but you'll be around other people that are passionate about what you're passionate about. That'll expose you to new ways of thinking about it. So exactly what Tiana was saying, keep falling in love with the problem over and over again.
I'll just put in a plug for Amalas here. They also religiously hire from MSCAP, so the MSCAP folks in the audience, find Ben afterwards.
That could be your boss.
There you go. Daniel, YC?
I can go. Yeah. So I honestly think, if you ask me in undergrad or even in grad school, and if I would be in the panel on data and democracy, I'd probably say no way. When I was in grad school, I was measuring people's neuroactivity and studying people, basically looking at faces and scenes. I don't know if any of you've done psychology studies or neuroscience studies. Essentially, like you have two options, choose one option, next trial. And it seems a little bit divorced from what I'm doing now. And I think basically it was really kind of serendipity where I was starting to look at motivational effects on perception, like how wanting to see something changes what you pay attention to. Published a paper on that, and people started saying, "Oh, that's just like politics." And I was just like, not really, not exactly. And then 2016, the election came and went, and it was a very deeply polarized time for a lot of America, and it just spurred, things just kind of came into place where I felt like I wanted to study this, even though this is something that I've never touched before. And my advisor was very supportive, which he didn't have to be, and we managed to find funding for it, and then we just pursued it. So honestly, I think if I had any advice to give, is to be open-minded about who you think you are and what your identity is, because it keeps changing as you move from stages and stages of your career, right? You might think like, oh, I study learning, and then after a while, you're just like, actually, this does relate to sort of like some of these other phenomena, and I want to get into it, and then look out, for opportunities where you might be able to find both the funding, the human resources, and also sort of like the financial resources to be able to pursue them. And the best way to do that is to always like keep an eye out on different opportunities that are around, come to events like these, meet new people, be sort of stimulated by ideas and the other work that other people are doing, and then find inspiration in it. And don't feel like don't create a box for yourself, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would echo all those thoughts. I think be curious is a really good one, and that very seldom is success a straight path. We presented ideas here that sounds like that was the first idea we had, and that's not really how it works. My background, I studied biology in undergrad until right at the very end, and I switched to computer science. I did a master's in data science, and then only then made my way back to biology. And then I took some time off and did some consulting with ABC, and then didn't do anything in the politics space until now I found my way back in the politics space. So I'd say it's not a straight path, and I know that's not really good advice to give because you can't really do anything about it, but just keep being curious, keep putting yourself out there, keep going to events like this, and yeah, I think you'll find your way into some interesting projects.
Sure. It's reassuring advice. That's what it is. That's what we need. So with that, I know we have a couple of minutes for audience Q&A. If you have a question, if you could raise your hand and just flag down one of my colleagues who have the mic. We have a question up here, and if you could share your name and what program you're with, if you're affiliated with the university or your organization. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. Sorry, I'm Joe. I'm with the DSI Summer Lab, actually. I want to thank everybody for a really interesting talk on a topic that's quite interesting to me. I had a sort of specific question for Mr. DeBow. I'm curious about the difficulty of trying to like quantify the governing ideology or the governing thought process, the narrative that exists inside sort of a polity. And I'm curious how exactly like you're able to turn that data into some sort of quantifiable method of gauging a specific narrative, and how that's quantified, and sort of how you connect that to actually being like, this is what we predict is what actually happening inside that political sphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And we're delivering this on scale to a lot of users, so it still will rely on a decent amount of interpretation. But sort of the front end, the way people interact with it, is you see the most discussed event in a country for a given time range. You then select that event, and you can see what events are being referenced at the same time with it. You can then follow that trail back to see what other events it connects to. So instead of just kind of seeing the event as it takes place, you can see the larger story that's being told. So it does still require a decent amount of interpretation. The extent of quantification really comes with what we decide to expose to the user. What the user then sees is something as simple as just the number of references and number of articles and the split between them. So at the end of the day, it really is up to the user to interpret that to get something meaningful about what the ultimate worldview of the authoritarian is.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm from DSI Summer Lab, and I work for Daniel. And I wanted to ask, so I've been experiencing a confusion lately, which is I feel like the things that give me joy in studying in academia are not related to other people's sufferings or whatever. And it makes me feel very torn because I feel selfish by exploiting my privileges and studying things that I like. And I was wondering, for you guys, if it relates, specifically, I want to know, are there any moral or value system driven questions or problems that you want to solve that you cannot solve with the toolkit or company or lab that you have right now? Like, what is something that you cannot do with your job that you wanted to with your motivation?
I mean, Melissa, that's a good one.
It's a very deep question. I guess I can start. I think this is definitely something that I sometimes resonate with. So I know the feeling that you're describing. I think part of like my involvement and the reason why I started this work was part of that, because I felt like the things that I was studying felt a little bit divorced from sort of like immediate challenges that were important to me. To be clear, like, different people, again, we've talked about sort of predispositions and worldviews, right? It might be important to someone else. I'm not sort of like placing any kind of value judgment on what people find they're passionate about. But there was a point in my graduate career where I felt like I wanted to study something that was a little bit more sort of like immediately relevant, right? Like, and once I had that feeling, I kept doing my day job and kept doing my work, but I did sort of look for opportunities to try to do something that felt a little bit more immediately relevant. I'm not saying that the work I'm doing now is going to like make an immediate impact, but at least it got me closer to a place where I felt like I'm inching towards something that I really wanted to do. Another thing that I really wanted to do. I want to do a lot of things, right? Like this is another thing that I want to be able to accomplish. So I think, if you have that feeling and you want to sort of like follow it a little bit, I think it's worth considering sort of like what are some opportunities that allow you to have be able to nurture that part of you. But it doesn't mean that you can't also explore the other parts of things that you find interesting. I think at the end of the day, it will be a balance. So there's no good, there's no right or wrong here. It's just sort of like a balance you have to navigate. I don't know if that's very helpful, but that's how I navigated it throughout my career, I would say.
And I think learning the tools are a really important step in that. So, we all have different tool sets, whether it's tools we use to analyze government or propaganda. In my case, it's computer science and NLP and computer vision. But those tools can be used in many different ways, right? This is one part of my job here. But I also work with the 11th Hour, and I get to use these tools to help a lot of nonprofits. And I think, especially in data science and computer science, there's a lot of nonprofits who are looking for your skill set. And so you have the ability to kind of help in that domain if you feel the call to work with those organizations.
I often have noticed in sort of purpose-driven work that there is a tendency to really put a lot of pressure on folks to be sort of saviors and see their individual solution as like the thing that is going to solve a huge problem in the world. And I think that I know that my work is having a direct impact on a problem that is really important to me, but something that was also really meaningful was to understand my work and my contribution in context to all of the other incredible work and contributions that just the folks sitting on this panel have, let alone brought more broadly out into the world. And I think that that helped to alleviate some of my own pressure on myself about how much time I give to the parts of my work that feel deeply important to democracy and the issues that I care about there. There's things that I care about all of the time that I don't have an expertise on and like can't professionally move forward, and I have to be okay with that. There's things that like, I don't know, over the weekend I was playing with pressed flowers that I grew in my backyard because like also that's something that I'm curious about and like brings me joy and helps sustain me to be able to do the parts about my work that can be more draining or that are the more professional aspects of the way that I have to show up. And so I share that just as like a few examples of trying not to limit myself to only seeing myself as someone who is like very serious about data and science. I also am someone who sometimes am really serious about flowers, and sometimes I'm not serious at all, and like all of those things are okay, and at different times in my life I've learned from showing up in different ways. And so I hope that if you choose to do things that don't feel super aligned with a big problem out into the world, that that you still find a lot of joy in that passion.
Yeah, I just echo all of that. We can tell you kind of have to understand your limits, but really you have to experience it yourself too, internalize it, and it's going to be really hard and really deflating when you realize like for all the problems in the world, all the advantages that we have just to get to this place, there's a limit to how much we can do. And if you're really lucky, you'll find something that's an overlap of what you're really good at and what change you want to see in the world. And just getting to that spot, even if it's not changing everything, really puts you in a unique position that not many people get to do with their lives. And all you can really do is hope you can gain a sense of meaning out of that.
It's great. So I'm now getting the signal that we need to wrap up because it turns out we have a lovely reception waiting for us upstairs. But with that, I'd like to take a moment to just thank our distinguished panelists. Just a round of applause for all of you. I want to thank everyone who joined us here in person at the Harris School of Public Policy, and also those who are joining us via live stream. If this is the sort of work that is of interest to you, please do follow CEG and DSI on social media. If you want to work with Ben, go get a degree from MSCAP. And all of our panelists are going to be upstairs and would love to engage with you all. So thank you all for spending this evening with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating.
Well done.
Thanks. You too.
I got to unmic. Say
I got right before I went up there, I got a message that this legislation will go nowhere, but that there's a congressman
So you
who
can
was
unplug the right
introducing
thing.
legislation to strip any organization that does private grant making to election departments of their tax status. They really just will not give up on 2020.
I don't know. Do you just like navigate? Are there days where you don't engage with news? Yeah. Because I feel like your work is like right on a daily basis in a way that some of the stuff it's not.
We don't know the half of it.
It's been a particularly weird last couple